Hiram Flavisham has been banned, and I think that the Disney Lorcana meta is wide open. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my predictions on where each of the color combinations might settle in terms of a meta. It's important to note, I haven't got an S tier. I think we're going to have a really healthy meta, at least I hope. I think there is going to be some standout decks potentially, but I actually think there's going to be a lot of decks really performing very, very well. Big shout out to Card Market who sponsored the video. It's on my face here. It's the biggest online marketplace for Disney Lorcana cards in Europe, and they sponsor the video. Let's start with Ruby Sapphire. I think a lot of people are going to instantly put Ruby Sapphire into the B tier. It lost Hiram. A lot of people in my comments are going to say, well, DKP's list was only running 3 Hirams. It was only running 2 Hirams. DKP, who we had on the live stream yesterday, if you want to go and watch that back, who is one of the best Ruby Sapphire players in the world, was saying, well, I only played Hiram because the other Sapphire players played Hiram. And while I still think that Ruby Sapphire can be a strong deck, I think particularly going down the route of Maui Half Shark, if you can get to that Maui Half Shark, that gives you an opportunity to bring back more cards into your hand. And DKP made the point, well, if Ruby Sapphire is less popular, people won't be teching for the Half Shark as much. There'll be less people playing things like And Then Along Came Zeus. That makes it better. While I agree with all that, I think what's really, really important to note about Ruby Sapphire and its lack of Hiram is just how crippling, not discard as a whole deck is, because that is going to be a terrible matchup for Ruby Sapphire moving forwards, but even just a simple Ursula Deceiver, the 2-cost Ursula, I think is going to be really, really crippling for this deck, because suddenly that one card that's being discarded is a much larger percentage of your hand. And Ruby Sapphire decks like to play How Far I'll Go and Be Prepared, which are both uninkable songs. Ursula Deceiver is going to have a field day against this, and as you're going to see in my tier list, I think that there's going to be a lot of Ursula Deceivers back into the meta. I think that Ruby Sapphire, oh my god, dislike the video, guys. I'm going to put it into the C tier. That's my prediction. I still think it's going to be strong. I think it's going to struggle. I think it's really easy to underestimate just how important Hiram was for this deck. And I want to be clear, I think it's like upper C tier, lower B tier. And this is just my prediction, but my honest gut feeling is that it's going to struggle. I really, really think it's going to struggle. Especially, I think it's going to have a terrible matchup against all-out discard decks. It's going to have a bad matchup against aggro decks. What will be interesting to see is how will the matchup be against Amber Steel, particularly an Amber Steel aggro deck. Historically, Amber Steel struggled against Ruby Sapphire, but these Amber Steel decks that we saw with Doc in the previous set, with Lilos as well, let's not forget, started to have a pretty reasonable matchup into Ruby Sapphire, and that's when they had access to Hiram. So it's going to be really, really fascinating. Maybe even like Bare Necessities could come into the Amber Steel decks as a tech card and discard things like the How Far I'll Go, the B Preps, the Mukduk Manas. I think that Ruby Sapphire is going to have a really hard time. I really, really do. Now, as time goes on and less people start playing it and less people start teching for it, maybe it could sneak up into here. But I'm putting it in the C tier. Dislike the video if you want. I'm just going to share my honest, unfiltered opinion. Let's look next at Sapphire Steel, because that's the other deck that's been hit. And for me, Sapphire Steel is going to be somewhere between the B tier and the A tier. There's going to be a lot of decks in the A tier. Sapphire Steel obviously lost a lot with the Photosphere being nerfed. However, if you look historically at the history of Disney Lorcana, Sapphire Steel has always been a deck which you can play competitively. You can play it with A Whole New World and Fishbone Quill. You can play it maybe with Doc. I just don't really see how Sapphire Steel isn't still going to be one of the best decks in the game. I will, again, stress, I'm going to have a lot of decks in this A tier. I think a really interesting discussion and thing that's going to be worth keeping an eye on is which of these decks will be better, because if you look at the Amber Steel Doc decks from the last set, they're pretty similar to what you might expect from the Sapphire Steel Doc builds, right? For Sapphire Steel, you've got Belle versus Cinderella. Now, before Photosphere was banned, Belle was just superior, but lacking that consistency now of Belle, you could definitely make a case for Cinderella to be a stronger Singer 3 card. And I think that these decks have some really interesting parallels. You've got the Doc version of both, but there's also potentially A Whole New World version of both. And it's going to be really interesting to see where each deck settles. I would wager that there's 4 different decks there, right? You've got Whole New World for both, you've got dock versions for both, and I think that all of them will find a pretty strong place in the metagame. Amber Steel you can't really go wrong with. Sapphire Steel is going to be better if you high roll, probably. I think both are going to be really good, but maybe Amber Steel just gets that little bit of an edge back. It has better 1-drops for the aggro build with something like Daisy Duck, whereas Sapphire Steel outside of the Bell doesn't really have many good turn 1 plays. Let's look at the Amethyst decks next, because I think you've got within this big widespread of card color combinations, ink color combinations, you've got Amethyst decks as a big group, and you've got discard decks as another big group. So let's try and tackle those next. You've also got some decks which I'm probably just gonna go ahead, sorry mate, and put like down in these tiers. Like I don't think these ones are suddenly going to be really good. I think that these are the worst 2 color combinations in the game. I will say that I think Amber Ruby is better than Amber Sapphire. These have like a little bit of potential. These are 2 color combinations I like quite a bit. But then with like the rest of these, it's quite easy to pair everything together in 2 big brackets, which is Amethyst decks and discard decks. So Amethyst decks, I would imagine, are going to be back and really strong. Last set, pretty much every Amethyst deck in the game was good. And if you actually think about how these Amethyst decks were competing at the start of the last set, it was very much about the Genie Wars. And I wouldn't be too surprised to see something like that return, which is why I am earmarking Amethyst Sapphire as a really interesting potential deck. In fact, it's the first deck which I've built, and I'm going to be playtesting when I'm at a tournament in Germany this weekend. I'm going to be a commentator at that tournament, but in the afternoons and the evenings when I've got some free time, I'm going to be doing some playtesting. And Amethyst Sapphire is a deck I'm really interested in. You can ramp on turn 2. This enables Genie on turn 3 and Elsa on turn 4. And what is likely to be a Diablo metagame where a lot of people are playing Diablo, you want to have good answers to Diablo. And that's also where Amber Steel and Sapphire Steel have a good place, right? These can both deal with Diablo pretty easily by singing songs, by maybe even ramping and hitting Diablo with grab your swords and things like that. And in a similar vein, I think Amethyst Sapphire has some pretty good tools to deal with Diablo, because you can get the Genie on 3, especially that Elsa on turn 4, maybe even like Peter Pan Shadow Finder or Peter Pan Shadow Catcher, which have evasive and rush. I think that Amethyst Sapphire is really well positioned. Amethyst Steel is, of course, always well positioned. You can adapt Amethyst Steel to any metagame, really, and make it work to some extent. I would imagine, because the Ruby Sapphire deck I'm predicting to be lower in the competitiveness of the set, of the metagame, I would imagine that Amethyst Steel can take on a slightly slower and more methodical approach. But that's also when you have to bear in mind when that sort of thing starts happening, when the rest of the metagame isn't being built to try and beat Ruby Sapphire, the Ruby Sapphire players can start rising up. So I would imagine that as time goes on, like Ruby Sapphire can start sneaking up. I do think it's close here, but I'm gonna go out and stick with my guns and say that I really don't think Ruby Sapphire is going to have much of a good time. It's important though with Amethyst Steel to also ask the question, okay, how are you going to answer a Diablo? And not that consistently well is the honest answer, but it has enough with Steel. You can play Fire the Cannons, you can play Strength of a Raging Fire as well. Of course, Elsa, once you get to 5, but it is significantly slower with Elsa and with Genie being able to take a Diablo compared to Amethyst Sapphire that can ramp. But it's got tools to do it, and it should be just fine. I would imagine it's probably going to be dock builds with Genie, but who knows, maybe you could even sneak in a few rabbits. Obviously, you've got the Giant Cobra in there potentially as well. I think Amethyst Steel will be, as always, one of the best decks in the meta. The other Amethyst decks then, we've got Ruby Amethyst, we've got Amethyst Emerald, and we've got Amethyst Amber. Amethyst Amber is probably, in my opinion, like the most underrated color combination in Disney Lorcana. I think Lantern is a card which is really significantly underestimated. If you guys want to try a really fun color combination, if you guys like playing Blurpool, I think Amber Amethyst can provide you with a very similar deck. You play Lantern on turn 2, you tap the Lantern immediately, and you can play a 1-drop like a Daisy or a Chernobog's, a Broom, or a Diablo. And then on turn 3, you can play a Genie. On turn 4, you can play an Elsa. So you can do very, very similar things to Blurple, but you have access to Amber cards instead, things like Rapunzel. Now, the biggest issue with that is that you can only play 4 copies of Lantern, whereas Sapphire can play Tipo, can play Sail, you can even play One Jump if you so desire. But it's definitely something worth bearing in mind. I think that there's the new dual ink cards that you have to keep in mind as well, because a lot of those have maybe been a little bit forgotten about with the Sapphire dominated meta that we had. But I think, for example, the Pascal in Amber Amethyst is really good. It's a 3/3 evasive that quests for 3? Maybe 2? I think it quests for 3. It's a good card either way. I'm pretty sure it quests for 3. And it can take out a Diablo even in a Hidden Cove, which could be pretty relevant. I think this deck is going to be solid. A lot of you are going to say, Speci, really? You're putting Amber Amethyst above Ruby Sapphire? And yeah, I really am, I think. I guess like a big question mark for the Amber Amethyst color combination is, how are you going to reliably deal with Diablo? And that's maybe where the deck becomes a little bit unstuck. You do have Peter Pan Shadow Finder and Peter Pan Shadow Catcher. You have Elsa as well, but you don't have access to things like grab your swords. Maybe like this would be more reasonable, but I honestly am just a pretty big believer in Amber Amethyst. But maybe we'll put this down into the C tier. Up next, we are going to have another couple of Amethyst decks. We've got Amethyst Emerald and Ruby Amethyst. Ruby Amethyst is going to be one of the best decks in the game. Simple as that. Ruby Amethyst always finds a way of doing the business. Ruby Amethyst did win both of the Continentals in Europe and North America, but let's not forget that there was only one Ruby Amethyst deck that made it to day 2 in North America with Ed, and he really, really pulled it out the bag with that one. If we are going into a pretty fast-paced meta, again, I think Amber Steel with like Bare Necessities is something you've really got to keep your eye on, because I think that card is a little bit forgotten about, but with Hiram going, I could just see it being more impactful in this matchup. And also like Lilo, how does Lilo impact Ruby Amethyst? Usually when you play a B prep, you clear the board, but then maybe that Amber Steel player can call out a Lilo, for example. You would imagine that, in my opinion, Amethyst Steel and Amethyst Sapphire should be beating Amethyst Ruby, because Ruby Amethyst, a lot of the Amethyst decks are really similar. You tend to have like 40 cards, which are the exact same. What do you get from each, right? From Steel, you get a bit of control, right? You get things like Strength, you get Dock, cool. Bit of tempo. With the Sapphire, you get the turn 2 ramp, which enables the Genie on 3, the Elsa on 4, which is really good against Dock, and it's really good in Amethyst Mirrors. And then obviously with Ruby, you get the B preps. If you can get to that stage, Ruby's in control. But usually I would expect, if I'm playing Ruby Amethyst and I'm up against any other Amethyst color, I would probably feel like I have a slight disadvantage, but then my other matchups are slightly better. So if it's a heavily dominated Amethyst meta, I do think that Ruby Amethyst is slightly unfavored into the other Amethyst colors, but the truth is often these Amethyst mirrors can just come down to who is the better player. And a lot of the time, that might be the Ruby Amethyst player, because the Ruby Amethyst players tend to know what they're doing, in my experience. Not all the time, but a lot of them do. I think Ruby Amethyst is going to be a really strong deck. I think it's going to have a higher player percentage than something like Amethyst Sapphire, but it really didn't get anything new, and it hasn't for a long time. I think the build with the libraries are the best. I played some Ruby Amethyst recently. I think it's going to do fine. I just think that the meta might be a little bit quick for it overall, and cards like Bare Necessities maybe being teched into Amber Steel might cause it some problems. Finally, we've got Emerald Amethyst, and Emerald Amethyst, again, it's another Amethyst there. That's why I can't really put Amber Amethyst all the way down in C tier, because I really don't think it's much worse than the rest, and I think it's got a chance, and it's worth... I really think this deck's underrated. I just think all the Amethyst decks come in a nice package. I think they're all really good. And Emerald Amethyst, what's the advantage of that? Ursula 2, really big advantage. You could play Diablo yourself. We've been seeing a lot of those Diablo decks doing really well. You could go down the discard route even with those Diablo decks. You could just play like a tempo build. You could play Cloud Kicker to deal with opponents' Diablos. It's got a lot of tools. And again, if you're playing up against Amethyst Ruby, you'd fancy yourself because you can go under them. Amethyst Steel versus Emerald Amethyst is always an interesting one. But yeah, that's basically where I would position the Amethyst decks. I think that it's going to be a bit of an Amethyst meta. I don't think that the Amethyst decks are necessarily the best. I just think that they're going to be across the board very strong. I think Amber Amethyst will be the least represented, but I think it's the dark horse. That if you guys want to cook up something interesting, put lanterns in your deck, play 4 China Bogs, 4 Diablos, 4 Brooms, and you can't go wrong, I think. Finally then, these last 3 decks are also coming as a package, and these are discard decks. That's right, I am putting Emerald Sapphire down as a discard deck because it has bend to my will. There's definitely other routes you could go with, for example, pretty much all of these decks that I've mentioned, but certainly Emerald Sapphire is one of the biggest dark horse decks in the game. It's very difficult to build, and actually I think the Hiram nerf has probably helped this deck more than any other, because I just had to play Hiram in my Emerald Sapphire decks because Hiram was so broken. It didn't really need it. It's just, imagine not playing Sapphire without it, right? You've got Clarabelle as a card draw tool. Ink Gazer can be a card draw tool. I think that it's an absolute dark horse and one to watch. And it's definitely one I'm really, really excited for. Like the 3 decks I'm most excited to play test are Amethyst Sapphire, Amber Amethyst, and Emerald Sapphire for sure. And then finally, you've got like the 2 main normie, if you will, discard decks, which is going to be Emerald Steel, Amber Steel. I think Emerald Steel is going to be really dominant to begin with. I think it's going to be good. And I think that this will also be really good. I think it's, for me, this is kind of how I would place it. Like, I think I wouldn't read too much into my ordering of things, like in each tier. I just think that you're going to have, at the top of the game, you're going to have a lot of Amethyst decks. You're going to have the Sapphire Steel and the Amber Steel, which are pretty similar. You can either go Whole New World or Dock, and you're going to have some discard decks. You're then also going to have some people wanting to, like me, try and experiment with these 2 decks to see if they can do something. You're still going to find your Ruby Sapphire players absolutely dreaming that their deck is still good. It's not, I'm pretty sure. I'm sure it's fine. I'm willing to be clipped and shipped. I'm putting my neck out there. That's fine. You're going to see a lot of people play it. I just think it's going to have such a torrid time into discard decks. I really, really do. Even like if you look at the rest of the decks above here, it's like, what deck above here do you think that Ruby Sapphire would have a favored matchup into now? And I honestly don't think there's a single one. I really don't. Discard, terrible matchup. Amber Steel with Lilos? I don't think I fancy Ruby Sapphire's chances. And especially if they start playing like bare necessities, right? Sapphire Steel, okay, maybe that's a favored matchup, but who knows how quick they can be with those McDuck manners. Amethyst, again, it's going to be tricky. I think what Ruby Sapphire has going for it is as the meta moves away from teching for it, it does become better. But I'm keeping it in the C tier, is where I believe it goes. And then you've got Amber Emerald. Amber Emerald can have a lot more discard. Obviously, you can play an aggro version of Amber Emerald as well. I'm more referring to a discard deck with Under the Sea and Kida here. I don't think it's a good meta for aggro anymore. Obviously, you guys would have seen in the LCC, I'm into the top 6 of the 16 best players in the world. I was playing a full aggro deck with Amethyst Steel. That was a meta call. I don't think that's a good meta call anymore, because I think Amethyst decks are going to be everywhere, which means Foxes will be everywhere. I don't think you want to be playing an aggro deck, but I think discard is really well positioned. Bare Necessities is great in this deck. The Muses is probably going to make a comeback in a big way as well, dealing with genies. I think that the discard decks will be really, really solid. And in case you're wondering on these other decks, like Ruby Steel, honestly, both of these decks, I'm pretty excited to see. You know, you could do something like this. I don't know. This might be a bit more reasonable, to be honest. This might be a bit more reasonable, but I'm just going to kind of keep it where I had it, to be honest. I quite like having Ruby Sapphire in C tier. People are not going to like it, but I like being controversial sometimes, you know, that's part of the fun. That's my overall opinion on my predictions for the meta. It's really easy to underestimate how good Hiram was and how few replacements there are for that card. Again, I wouldn't read too much into each of the positions on here. I just think this is what you can expect to see. Lots of Amethyst decks, Amber Steel and Sapphire Steel, discard. A little bit of Ruby Sapphire and some of these other decks. Because, yeah, I think that Ruby Steel and Ruby Emerald are both worth checking out. Like Ruby, to be honest, Ruby Steel, I played a lot of and I really, really liked it. It just always lost to Ruby Sapphire, no matter how I built it. Well, that's probably not the case anymore, right? And similarly, Ruby Emerald is a deck I've always really loved. So I think that both of these decks, you know, I honestly could see it settling like this, but we'll leave it like that for now. My Dark Horse decks, if I was you and you're looking for something really exciting to cook up that not many people are going to expect, would be Amber, Amethyst, Emerald, Sapphire, Ruby Steel, Ruby Emerald, Blurple as well. I think Blurple is going to be good. I really, really do. That's my tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Give it a like if you did. Thanks again to Card Market for sponsoring the video. I am going to be casting a big tournament in Leipzig this weekend. Looking forward to it. I appreciate you all. Thanks for the support and see you soon.